Stephen C. Meyer, welcome to the Uncertainty Podcast.
I'm glad to be here. It's nice to be talking to an Oxbridgian.
Yes, quite so. So I wanted to begin on a more informal note because I can't help myself. You were interviewed about a little over 2 years ago on the Joe Rogan Experience. How was that? How did that go? I'm so curious.
Well, I get asked about this a lot.
Yes.
In fact, I've been joking when I'll get introduced at conferences now, and people don't care that I did my PhD at Cambridge University, or
you were on the Joe Rogan Experience.
I've written several books or whatever.
Yeah.
And he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. Yeah. Well, it was actually a lot of fun. I felt strangely unnervous until I got in the car going over, and then I thought, now what are we going to talk about?
Right.
And but fortunately, his driver, who was I guess one of his security guys, he was a ex-Marine, ex-military, something. He just started asking me a bunch of questions. Got my head into the interview, and I just walked in, shook Joe's hand. We sat down. There were no preliminaries.
Right.
He didn't say, "Oh, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about that. How do you feel about that?" He just dove right in with questions.
Yes.
And 3 hours and 20 minutes later, we were finished. And it was a little bit like a good philosophy seminar. He asked very probative questions. He was skeptical, obviously, to a degree, but it was the questions were fair and the conversation was fun. It was very wide-ranging. Afterwards, we touched on so many topics. I got to wondering, what all did I say?
Yes.
What else did he ask me about?
Yes.
But it was a lot of fun. We had there were a number of social media influencers who took modular bits of the interview and then pushed it out. And last I heard, we were over 50 million derivative views of the modular bits of the interview. I don't know how many downloads he got. So I'm getting stopped in airports and things just because of that one interview. It's kind of crazy.
Were you a beneficiary of like the Joe Rogan effect? Like you went on and then did you see a substantial increase in interactions with your work, purchases of your book? Like,
of course,
did you notice it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. But so did other people whose work I highlighted in answers.
Yes.
I have a colleague and friend who's a very well-known psychiatrist at UCLA, Jeffrey Schwartz, and I mentioned Joe asked me a question about the mind-body question and whether I believed in free will or determinism, and I cited Jeff's work, his fairly well-known book titled "You Are Not Your Brain," and a few days after the podcast dropped, I got a call from him, and he said, "Hey, I just found that my book shot up to #1 in psychology at Amazon, and I couldn't figure out what happened. Somebody told me that you mentioned me, and that was the explanation." So yeah, he's got a huge audience for sure.
Yes. Well, I can promise almost as big a bump in your sales as a result of being on my podcast.
Let's go for it. Yeah.
So I think you did a good marketing decision here. With that, we're here to talk about your book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, where you concentrate on essentially 3 scientific discoveries that you suggest are best explained by the God hypothesis. So why don't you give us the God's eye view of what you're doing in the book? Just the nutshell statement of your argument, and then as I do, I will myself ask probative questions. We'll start with that.
Excellent. So my first 2 books were Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. And in each of those books, I made arguments for design based on the information-bearing properties of living systems. But insofar as living systems arise long after the beginning of the universe, I acknowledged that I did not attempt to make a case for the designer of life being necessarily God. It was at least, I acknowledged, logically possible that an agent within the cosmos might have been responsible for the information-bearing properties of DNA that we see arising in the first life and then in major explosions of life, such as the Cambrian explosion. I'm a theist. That isn't my view, but I had to acknowledge the logical possibility of an immanent intelligence within the cosmos being responsible for those distinctive features of living systems that I argue point to intelligence, digital code being one of them. And so my readers wanted to know, well, who do you think the intelligence is that's responsible for life? And what can science tell us about that? And so the return of the God hypothesis is an attempt to address that question. And I did that by bringing in evidence from physics, the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe, and from cosmology, the evidence that we have suggesting that the universe had a beginning, and made the case that no being within the cosmos could be responsible for the origin of the universe itself or for the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the basic properties of physics, initial conditions of the universe. And so if there was evidence of design, it was pointing in a transcendent direction. And near the end of the return of the God hypothesis, I draw these three lines of evidence together. I look at competing systems of thought, competing worldviews, not only theism, but deism, pantheism, materialism. In a long footnote, I look at panentheism. And I argue that only theism has the causal power to explain the three key pieces of evidence that I look at. The evidence for a singular beginning to the universe, the evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe from the very beginning, and the evidence of increases or infusions of information into the biosphere long after the beginning. That when you add those three things up, I suggest that we're looking at evidence of a designing intelligence that is both transcendent but also active in the creation long after the beginning of the universe. So that's a sketch of the overall structure of the argument, and there's a lot of meat in the middle to unpack those various arguments.
Yes. So the three ways are the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and then what's the third? The information present in living organisms?
The origin of the information necessary to build the first life. And as a little icing on the cake, I also look at the informational requirements for building the first animals. There's a major discontinuity in the fossil record where we see most of the major animal body plans and the information necessary to build them arising very abruptly in the history of life. And I am myself persuaded that that is also an instance of relatively discrete design affecting the biosphere.
Okay. So let's begin big picture. You are considering the God hypothesis. So what form does the God hypothesis take? I mean, just in common discourse and throughout cultures, the word God means a variety of different things. So when you say the God hypothesis, like delineate for us exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. I in the book posit an intelligence, a conscious mind that has the following attributes. Number one is has volition and is conscious and transcendent, and also capable of acting within the cosmos, not like a deistic deity that confines its activity to the beginning of the universe.
So this isn't the full-orbed concept of God that you might read from like Richard Swinburne, or just what we might call the omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good. This is a more modest conception of God, which you're claiming to have evidence for. Is that right?
Well, it's more modest in one sense, but more robust in some others. It's not merely a deistic creator. It's not merely an unidentified alien or immanent intelligence. So I argued to those attributes which I think the natural world attests, and leave open ample scope for not only natural theology but revealed religion to fill in the rest of our concept of God and understanding of his actions in time, space, and history.
So in any inference to the best explanation, you're comparing hypotheses against one another. You can't ever proceed in kind of an isolated way where you've only considered one and then you determine it's the best. The inference is only as good as the work you put in to survey alternatives to see if one might be better. So what are the main explanatory alternatives that you focus on in the book? You can't consider every logical possibility to the God hypothesis, but you pick the main ones. And what are those?
Yeah, theism, deism, pantheism, and materialism.
Okay.
If you think of, and these are there's always variations on themes, but if you think of, I have a little kind of flow chart near the end of the book where I show that there's certain basic questions you could every worldview has to ask. What the first one is, what is the prime reality? In philosophical terms, we talk about the question of ontology, and the first question would be, is there a God? Yes or no? If you say yes, you're a theist of some kind. If you say no, you're an atheist and typically a materialist of some kind. If you elect for a God option, you can ask, well, is the God personal or is it an impersonal God? If it's personal, if it has agency, conscious awareness, then you're talking about something like either theism or deism. If you say no, it's the God, or the God is impersonal, then you're looking at something like a pantheistic conception of God. Panentheism is a kind of hybrid. I deal with that in a long footnote. But it's not that difficult to break the basic metaphysical options into some, or to separate a few separate metaphysical options, and those are the ones that I compare for their explanatory power. A personal God, an impersonal God, materialism, no God, and then a personal God who only acts at the beginning of the universe versus a personal God who acts at the beginning of the universe and also acts after the beginning of the universe along the cosmic timeline. So that would be the deism versus theism distinction.
Right. Okay. That's what I was going to ask. Is here deism means a creator God that is only active at the beginning and then lets things unwind unto their own accord.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Well, good. So the first data point is the beginning of the universe. I think in any of these three instances, you can kind of ask two questions, or there's two stages to the conversation. The first is just establishing what the relevant data is. Like, what evidence do we have at our disposal? And then the second step is arguing that the God hypothesis is the best explanation of that evidence. So in this case, the putative fact is the beginning of the universe. But I know many an atheist and just cosmologist who would dissent from that opinion, that it's even the case that the universe began to exist. So why don't you walk us through the reasons for thinking that the universe had a beginning?
Well, sure. There's been a body of observational evidence over the last 100 years, starting with the detection of the redshift, the expansion, indicating the expansion of the galaxies, suggesting that the universe is expanding outward in the forward direction of time. And if you back extrapolate, as cosmologists have done since the 1920s, they come to a limiting case in the reverse direction of time. Other evidence, such as the cosmic background radiation, also been best explained by positing an initial hot Big Bang state and a beginning point to the expansion of the universe. I think the story got more interesting as people started to bring in the theoretical physics, the general relativity. Einstein was aware in the 19-teens that his formulation of general relativity implied a dynamical universe, but he was uneasy with that, so he posited a very particular value for his cosmological constant, and to try to depict the universe as neither expanding nor contracting. Both the empirical evidence and even the solutions to his equations indicated that was not a stable answer to the question, and so he ended up eventually realizing that the universe had to have a beginning. In the 1960s, the whole question of the beginning was revisited, and partly because Stephen Hawking was thinking about he was doing black hole physics. He's thinking about the evidence of an expanding universe. He realizes that in the forward direction of time, the matter in the universe is getting more and more diffuse. But then he begins to think about, well, what would happen in the reverse direction of time? And he's thinking about, now, all this in light of general relativity, which implies that, or that asserts that matter is providing curvature to space, that massive bodies curve space. So if matter is more and more diffuse in the reverse direction of time, then space gets more and more tightly curved as you go further and further back. And his depiction of the universe, where he's conjoining the observational astronomy with the theory of general relativity, suggests that there's a limiting case, that you can only go so far back before the curvature gets effectively infinitely tight. There is a small loophole there that we can discuss because of the when you get inside Planck time or Planck space, you get this problem of quantum effects predominating. But in the large scale structure of space-time that he wrote with George Ellis in 1972 or 73, they said, you can't prove an absolute singularity, but it's a near singularity, as good as. And so you have this kind of convergence of observational astronomy and theoretical physics, both pointing to a beginning. There are conditions that have to be met to get an absolute singularity. I discuss all that in the book, but my point in the book is that you have these very strong indicators of a beginning, not an absolute proof. And if we take those indicators to be pointing to a beginning, or if we reverse, or if we invert that and say, if we posit a beginning, the kind of evidence we have is exactly what we would expect, then taking that as you put it, a putative data point, that suggests the need for a cause that's independent of matter, space, time, and energy. Matter, space, time, and energy come into existence a finite time ago, then separate from the universe or before the universe began, you have to posit something that's there's no. Let me put it this way: independent of the universe, you have no matter to do the causing. So that's the sort of sketch of the first order argument.
Well, I wonder about this use of the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems, because the first response you're going to get from a more skeptically inclined audience is that the conditions of these theorems do not plausibly apply to our universe. One of which being certain energy conditions, the weak energy conditions, I think, which we know to be violated in certain reasonable contexts. But then probably more importantly is that these theorems presuppose the general theory of relativity. And we know that the general theory of relativity is incompatible with quantum mechanics. And so the whole framework that you're presupposing doesn't apply, at least in totality, to the universe we actually inhabit. And so we would need a different theorem.
I'm super well aware of all that, Miles. I've been interpreted. In fact, I had a debate with someone over at Oxford recently, Phil Halper,
yes,
who has come out with a video and asserting that I am wedded to a singularity-based apologetic for God. And both he and Roger Penrose, who have also critiqued me, really simply didn't read the argument of the book. I make a first-order argument, but I also make a second-order argument. And the argument I develop is not based on the absolute proof of a beginning, because, as you mentioned, there are these weak energy conditions, other conditions that have to apply. I think so what I argue in the first part of the book is that the best indicators, that what we have are indicators of a beginning that are best explained by the postulation of a beginning, which in turn can be explained by a theistic hypothesis. But in the latter part of the book, I look at, for example, the different formulations. I look at the idea of quantum cosmology, which is an attempt to acknowledge that inside Planck time, you have a situation in which whatever exists prior to inside that tiny bit of space and that tiny bit of time is both spatially discrete and spatially extended at the same time. This is the whole mystery of the quantum world. And so because it's both potentially spatially discrete and spatially extended at the same time, we can't really treat it as if it generates curvature. So at that point, general relativity would break down. But then you do have at that point, a need for a quantum mechanical description of the early universe. And what I show there is that if you then opt for that, if you say, well, these indicators are not sufficient to convince us that the universe had a beginning, I think it's very odd that we require an absolute proof of that, where nothing in science can be absolutely proven.
Right.
But let's opt instead for a quantum mechanical description of the universe. And then what you get is a prior mathematical state, which is in a huge apparatus of mathematics, a Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which when solved produces a universal wave function, which is describing that early state of the universe within Planck time. And the description there is of a wave of possible different universes, each with different geometries and configurations of matter. And the quantum cosmologists assert that if we have a universal wave function that includes among that ensemble of possibilities a universe like our own, we will have explained the origin of our universe. But you only get a universal wave function that includes a universe like our own if prior to that the Wheeler-DeWitt equation is solved in a very specific way. You impose very specific boundary constraints on that functional differential equation in order to get a universal wave function that gives you the kind of options that include a universe like our own. So in other words, what's posited as being prior to Planck time is effectively a mathematical reality, not a physical one, that includes a range of possibilities. And prior to that, and that mathematical reality, you've got two phases. You've got the Wheeler-DeWitt equation that has to be constrained in order to get a universal wave function that includes our universe as an outcome. So effectively, there's a huge amount of prior fine-tuning of the mathematical system in order to explain or produce a universe like ours. And so my point is that it's perfectly possible to circumvent the sort of the standard cosmological argument based on the putative fact of a beginning, but the cost of doing so invariably involves a large input of information arbitrarily by the physicist in modeling how the universe would come into existence. In other words, what's being modeled is actually a form of intelligent design. You can think of it as fine-tuning or an input of information. So the argument is not, my cosmological argument is not based solely on the putative fact of the beginning, but rather it's a robust argument that's factually predicated, that has the same conclusion. Either way, it's factually predicated. If it's predicated on the beginning, there's a clear implication of theism. If it's predicated on a prior mathematical reality that is not itself physical but rather conceptual, and if the mathematical concepts have to be constrained to produce the kind of outcome that would allow us to explain the origin of the universe, then you're looking at a kind of fine-tuning argument, or an argument for intelligent design based on the input of the required input of information to do the explanatory work. Typically, when I explain this in a lecture, I break down quantum cosmology into three key elements. There's the explanandum, the thing that needs to be explained, which is the universe. There's the thing that does the explaining, which is the universal wave function, psi. And then there's the warrant for the psi function that is chosen. And the warrant comes from solving the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which is the analog to the Schrodinger equation in the cosmological setting. And the warrant is provided by a particular solution to the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. But the Wheeler-DeWitt equation is a functional differential equation that has effectively an infinite number of solutions. And to get a discrete solution out, you have to constrain a number of key variables and boundary constraints. And so those constraints are always applied by the physicist with an end in mind, namely with a universal wave function that would include a universe like ours, thus allowing the wave function to, quote, explain the origin of our universe. So what's actually being modeled is an end-directed teleological process that requires an input from an arbitrary input and indeed an end-directed input from the physicist to model. And this is really clear when you read the technical papers of, say, Hawking and Hartle or Vilenkin when they are.
So yes, that's what I was going to say, though, is that
depicting this mode of explaining the origin of the universe.
Yes, but that's what I was going to say, though, is that I think what you're describing concerns only semi-classical approaches to quantum gravity, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I am. But that leaves open string theoretic proposals or loop quantum gravity, so that my point is that the critique you make of semi-classical approaches might be perfectly fair, but that doesn't then mean that all viable quantum cosmological models have this feature, but just this one family, which is approximate anyway. We don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity. And so it's just not clear the kinds of extrapolations we can make from known physics into these unknown regimes. Because that's what I've been going back and forth with Dan Linford, for example, about a philosopher of physics. Is like, on what basis are we confident in our extrapolations from known physics to unknown physics? Because it is true, we just don't have a quantum theory of gravity. But that's exactly what we would need in order to describe the universe in its first state and to resolve, I assume, whether it had a beginning or not. Now, maybe I'm missing something in the logic.
Again, the beginning is not a necessary condition of my argument. It is interesting in the quantum cosmological case that we're just discussing. If you read the technical papers as opposed to what Hawking wrote popularly, they never get rid of the singularity. They presuppose the singularity, but my argument here is not about beginning or no beginning, and this is a misinterpretation. It's a misrepresentation and a straw man critique by Halper and others. My argument is that you have an epistemic cost to circumventing the beginning in these cosmological models, and one aspect of that epistemic cost is a vast amount of new unexplained fine-tuning. So you may get around a Kalam-style cosmological argument, but you end up underwriting a cosmological argument from contingency or from fine-tuning. And this is also true in the loop quantum gravity case. I have a long footnote in the book about this. But the conversation you're initiating is very timely and right on point. And it happens because of this conversation I've had with Halper, that two of my colleagues and I are writing up a systematic critique. We're actually scoring these new cosmological models. And what we've found is that and there are so many of them now, which, by the way, is not the sign of a healthy research program. Go back to your Thomas Kuhn. When you have a proliferation of models, what you have is actually a sign of a degenerate research program. But setting that aside, time and time again across the board, as we've evaluated these, you have several different types of epistemic cost. If you want to jettison the idea of the beginning, you're going to require an absolute proof. Okay, fine. But loop quantum gravity has unexplained fine-tuning. The Steinhardt model has unexplained fine-tuning. The Penrose model, where he first invoked a phantom field, now he has error-bonds, a new theoretical entity, but they're produced by a kind of field that also has to produce the right number of error-bonds with the right mass at the right time to exactly balance the cosmological constant to get in the crossover phase of his model a new galaxy-friendly universe where galaxies can be formed. So all of these models and the costs that we are identifying are, first of all, unexplained fine-tuning, all of them. This goes back to Einstein, by the way. He got around the problem of the dynamical aspect, the dynamical implications of general relativity for the universe, but he did so by fine-tuning the cosmological constant. His error was not positing a cosmological constant; it was an arbitrary fine-tuning of the value. And so this has been a move of cosmologists when they've been confronted with the evidence of the beginning for a very long time. But we're finding in all of these models, there's unexplained fine-tuning. There's the postulation of numerous arbitrary theoretical entities. Typically, there are violations of known physics, and sometimes, as with Hawking's Wick rotation move and Penrose's rescaling, there's a bit of mathematical sleight of hand as well. So it's completely possible to get around the case for a beginning, but there's a huge epistemic cost, and the cost is high for naturalism as a system, in particular because of the unexplained fine-tuning. So perfectly aware of all these other models that are out there. We're actually doing a thorough scoring and evaluation of each of them. Stay tuned. We'll be coming out with some things in the spring, which is much more detailed. I think this is a very exciting new development in cosmology. I commend Halper and F. Shorty, his co-author, for their excellent exposition of all these models. In fact, we've found in the literature, they have about 24 or 25. We've found about 15 more. Our tally right now is 41. And as you implied, there are families of models that have different things in common. But the idea that any of this is friendly to naturalism as a philosophical system is what we challenge. It's not. And you either have a Kalam-style argument or I don't make the Kalam-style argument. I don't make an argument from the beginning in a deductive form as Bill Craig and others do. I make it as an inference to the best explanation of a putative fact for which I think we have significant warrant, not proof. But if you don't accept that argument, which has theistic implications or a theistic conclusion, then the alternative is to adopt one of these other approaches, and there I think you end up invariably underwriting some kind of argument from contingency or fine-tuning.
Mm. Well, what about...
In other words, theism ends up getting supported on other grounds.
What about proposals according to which space-time emerges from a non-spatiotemporal structure at the most general level? That would allow the naturalist to say that the universe has a finite lifetime. It's only been around for a finite amount of time, but in a sense, it's still eternal because what precedes the finite lifetime of the universe is a timeless aspect. I think there are ways of making that coherent, and it would be in a similar way to you might want to make coherent the idea that God is timeless without the universe, but temporal since the moment of creation. That's the model William Lane Craig defends. But what about that, the theological point aside, what about these proposals where space-time is an emergent phenomenon, that at the most fundamental level, there's no time and there's no strict causality? That might give you grounds for avoiding the inference from the universe is finitely old to the universe began to exist.
Why don't we stay tuned on some of this? We're actively developing critiques. Are you talking about something like the Sean Carroll model, where he's got time going in different directions, or is this another sort of are you talking about kind of another theistic conception of time? You've got your A time and B time, and I mean, there's so many things going on here. It's a little. This is the sort of the level at which I think it's constructive to have this conversation is in a bit broad strokes. I'm giving you kind of a framework.
Yeah.
We have a framing of this argument, and the framing is not dependent on the absolute proof of the singularity. Penrose critiqued me for saying that in a podcast that he did with Halper in response to a podcast I did with somebody else. But I went through in very careful detail, acknowledging the energy conditions that are necessary to get an absolute proof from the singularity theorems of a beginning. So our framing is different. It's not, the framing is that there are strong indicators of the beginning. The empirical evidence is pointing that way in what in maybe in any other context would seem to be decisive. But if you don't want to accept that, that's fine. You can formulate infinite universe cosmologies, but when you do that, there's a cost. There's a cost often to coherence, there's a cost to parsimony, and there's certainly a cost to naturalism, because we have yet to find a model that doesn't invoke significant prior unexplained fine-tuning. And so I'll just be coming out, my colleagues and I will be coming out with more material on that in the spring. And I'm just very grateful to you for raising this, because this is, I think, right on point. I wrote a précis, as I mentioned today, for a conference on philosophy of cosmology. Let's keep in touch. Maybe we'll get you invited.
Yeah.
The discussion going. But the idea or the portrayal of my argument or that of colleagues with whom I'm working that suggests that we're not aware of these other cosmological models, or that we're wedded to a Big Bang singularity only. That's the only way to make the theistic case. That's not true. We're saying, look, pick your poison, naturalists. If you accept the indicators of a beginning, as many people do, you have a theistic implication you've got to deal with. If you want to eliminate that or circumvent that or propose an infinite universe cosmology instead, the infinite universe cosmologies that are being proposed are often very convoluted. They often involve violations of known principles of physics. They often involve some mathematical sleight of hand, but they certainly involved unexplained fine-tuning, which is not a friendly fact to philosophical naturalism.
Well, so let's tie the threads on then the second stage, where the contention is that if theism is true, if the God hypothesis is true, then the evidence of the beginning of the universe is not terribly unlikely. It's made relatively probable. But if naturalism or one of the competitor hypotheses is true, it is very, very unlikely that we would observe or have the data of a beginning of the universe, and therefore a beginning is evidence for theism over the alternatives. What's the gist of the reason for thinking that theism makes a cosmic beginning more likely? Because you're not giving a deductive argument. That's the thing that is interesting, is that, William Lane Craig can rattle off, number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, by logical necessity, the universe has a cause. You can't get around it if you grant the premises. But in an inference to the best explanation, you have to argue that your hypothesis predicts the data better than the alternatives. And I was just very curious.
Or expects it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So how do you get a beginning out of the God hypothesis? Because I always think, well, maybe God wouldn't want to create anything. And so in that respect, there's not a strict deduction from God exists to there's a universe.
Miles, you're asking all the best questions. The dialogue we're having is right on point. I addressed this very thing in chapter 12 of Return of the God Hypothesis. There are theists who think that God might have existed from eternity past, providing a kind of ground of being for an eternally existing universe, but not with the universe not having a temporal beginning. So the question is, the argument is not that we know that if God existed, there must have been a beginning, and because we have indications of a beginning, therefore God provides the best explanation, but rather that the evidence of a beginning is more likely on theism than it is on naturalism. Naturalism is committed to the idea of an eternally self-existent, self-creating, self-organizing universe. And the offense of the Big Bang theory from the beginning has been an offense to the sensibility of naturalists that are derivative from the assumption of an eternally self-existing universe. So on naturalism, evidence of a beginning is not to be expected. It's extremely unlikely, whereas it's more expected on a theistic hypothesis. It's possible on theism that God did not create a universe with a temporal beginning, but it's also possible that he did, which makes it more likely on theism than it does on naturalism. And if you're a religious theist, it makes it much more likely on theism, because you have the scriptural testimony of a finite universe, the first words of the Bible, after all, being in the beginning.
Mm. And what of the atheist like Quentin Smith, who says the universe came into existence from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing? There was just no cause at all. That's my hypothesis. What's intrinsically implausible about it?
I once heard Bill Craig respond to that in a way that I thought was quite compelling. He said, if that's the case, it's equally plausible that Bengal tigers pop into existence for no reason, or anything else for that matter. The Quentin Smith can circumvent the force of various cosmological arguments by denying causality, but the cost, there's a high epistemic cost to that, and that is the destruction of rationality and indeed science. And this is actually a theme in the latter part of my book as well, that when we get into various speculative multiverse cosmologies, and when you get into Boltzmann brain problems and other things that destroy our confidence in the reliability of the human mind, it is possible to circumvent the force of God arguments, of theistic arguments, but there is always an epistemic cost, and one of those costs is the destruction of confidence in rationality. And I would say that applies as a that's I think a fair rejoinder to Quentin Smith's proposal.
Well, that is a natural segue point to the fine-tuning of the universe. This is the second body of data that you will contend is best explained by the God hypothesis. So walk us through a few examples of cosmic fine-tuning. Here, in contrast, I think, to a beginning of the universe, there's more consensus that fine-tuning is a fact. You have dissenters, but I think that they're in the small minority. Fine-tuning for life among the fundamental physical parameters is pretty well established. But what are some examples of that to give us an idea?
I'd like to make one more point about your consensus
Okay.
about there not being a beginning. What you have is a lot of modeling. You have evidence that's pointing in an obvious direction towards a beginning, not a proof, and there are ways around it, and the ways around it involve modeling. But the models that are being constructed are highly implausible and have a high epistemic cost. And so I think it's important to point out the difference between the common sense implications of the empirics, of the empirical observational evidences, which are pointing to a limiting case in the finite past, as opposed to the way in which it's possible to model anything to restore an infinite universe. So I detect just a slight philosophical jab there by referring to consensus here. There's a consensus because, in my view, there is also still a dominant presupposition of philosophical naturalism, and that is generating a great desire to model the universe on terms that are favorable to naturalism, which requires an infinite universe cosmology. And so this is our interest in addressing these models. So we want to show that as those models are generated, they do come at a very high cost, and the cost is precisely to naturalism, as well as to parsimony and these other things that I mentioned. So I think that the dialectic is much more subtle than people are letting on. It's not just that, oh, hey, the singularity theorem doesn't work as an absolute proof because these different energy conditions aren't satisfied. Therefore, we're free now to dispense with any idea of a beginning, when the overwhelming testimony of the observational and empirical evidence from observational astronomy is pointing precisely towards a limiting case a finite time ago. So anyway, I've said my piece there. And it's absolutely fair question on your part. I'm just pushing back a little bit because that's the nature of these kinds of discussions, right?
Fair. Yeah. What was it that I... Oh, yeah. Could you give us some examples of some fine-tuning in that case?
Fine-tuning, well, there's so many. And I Luke Barnes and his PhD supervisor here from Cambridge, whose name I'm suddenly forgetting, have written this great book about the fortunate universe. It's a really fun book because Barnes is a theist and his former supervisor is a philosophical naturalist, and they both agree that fine-tuning is a fact. And then they have a very interesting discussion near the back of the book in which they entertain the different interpretations from a theistic or non-theistic point of view. One of my favorite is the cosmological constant, that you have this this outward pushing force that Einstein postulated, and it does turn out to be fine-tuned, just not the way Einstein thought, and it's an accepted value. There's a range of accepted, or a range of values that physicists have entertained, but I think an accepted value is something like 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. So it's an exquisite degree of fine-tuning. The fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, the initial entropy that Penrose has highlighted, another striking example, and then so many others having to do with the force constants, the fundamental constants of the four fundamental forces of physics. I think those are particularly interesting because they're clearly contingent features of the logical structure of the laws that describe those forces. They're not something that can be described by the forces themselves. They're contingent values that are extrinsic to the logical structure of the expression of those forces as physical laws.
Mm. Yeah, so I agree with you. I don't have any substantive questions about the fact of fine-tuning. Rather, the more interesting question will then be what hypotheses best explain it.
What do we make of it?
What do we make of it?
Yeah, exactly.
So the underlying idea here, like all of the claims we've been making, or the data points, is that theism makes this outcome more likely than naturalism. And so when we go and actually find this outcome, we observe it, that is some evidence for theism over naturalism. Why does naturalism make fine-tuning particularly unlikely? Why should we think that?
Well, Sean Carroll has done a good job, I think, of framing this and explaining that naturalism as a system of thought wants as an explanatory primitive to refer everything to the laws of nature. And if we think about the laws of nature as expressed as differential equations or perhaps as algorithms, the laws of nature do not determine their own initial conditions, their own boundary constraints that delimit the range of their applicability, nor do they determine the contingent values of the constants that are the focus of a lot of interest in fine-tuning, the gravitational force constant or the electromagnetic force constant. And so these have values that, as far as we can tell from any physical theory or from, there's neither a logical reason or an underlying physical theory that determines those values, but instead leaves them indeterminate from the standpoint of those underlying physical laws and forces. And therefore, on naturalism, we would not expect a specific fine-tuning value that would allow for a life-friendly universe, but our overwhelming expectation would be for a value that was one of the other ones, if you have a huge range of possibilities, and naturalism allows for all of them, naturalism being the basic logical structure of physical law, then what we would overwhelmingly expect is a value that does not render a life-friendly universe. Luke Barnes has, I think, argued this very persuasively and has a nice example of a kind of a burglar going to crack the safe, and if you don't know what the burglar's going to do, if you don't know whether he's been given information, let's see, how does he plays this out? He's got your inside job hypothesis and your random fiddling hypothesis. On the random fiddling hypothesis, you would expect, if you've got 1 in 10 trillion possible dial settings, you're going to expect one that you're not going to be able to predict what the precise value will be. But on the random fiddling hypothesis, the no design hypothesis, you're going to expect that the burglar is going to find a combination that's not going to open the lock. But if it's an inside job and he's been given the combination, you have right to expect something very different, namely that he'll open the safe, or at least it's much more likely that he would open the safe on the inside job hypothesis, the the design hypothesis than it is on the no design hypothesis. So I think something like that's at work in assessing the sort of the Bayesian kind of probabilities calculus that you would apply to the fine tuning. And that I think that underwrites a strong inference to the best explanation for theism over naturalism.
So when I'm willing to grant that like single universe naturalism, or I think what you call basic naturalism, does lend a very low likelihood to fine tuning, because there's just a huge range of possible alternative values that do not result in life. And those all seem equally likely. But now let's...
Can I stop you right there? Because I appreciate you making that distinction, because this is one of the things about the structure of my book, A Return of the God Hypothesis. With both the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the arguments that I make for biological design, I have a basic prima facie case, okay? And then I come back and look at a second-order case that looks at, so in the case of fine-tuning, I look at what I call basic naturalism, single universe naturalism. But then I come back and look at the multiverse as an alternative. In the same way with the cosmology, I say, look, okay, we've got these indicators of a beginning. What follows from that? Well, what follows from that prima facie is some sort of theism or deistic hypothesis over against naturalism or pantheism. But I acknowledge that's not the only way you could look at it. You could slice and dice this another way. And so let's look at what a naturalist is going to say, a more sophisticated naturalist who's going to invoke a quantum cosmological model, or a loop quantum gravity model, or a Steinhardt model, or a Penrose model, and then come back and say, but those ways of circumventing the prima facie case have their own theistic implications, and the same thing is going to apply when we get to the fine-tuning case. And I appreciate you noting that I made a distinction between basic naturalism and then something like the newer multiverse cosmologies that I think require a different kind of engagement and dialectic.
Yes. No, and I think that's very helpful, because the issues arising from, it keeps things very clean. The issues arising from single universe naturalism, which is the historical predominant idea, and then the issues arising from a multiverse are distinct. So, but nevertheless, even
in other words, I'm making an appeal here to your listeners and to those who may have heard Halper or Penrose critiquing me of late. Please read the whole book, the second half as well as the first half, because I'm well aware of these nuances and possible objections. But I have objections to the objections. I respond to the objections, and those responses have not been addressed. And so the dialectic, I think the ball is in the other side's court dialectically, although we're taking up the challenge of responding to this very, I think, helpful exposition that Halper and F. Shorty have produced with their book, The Battle for the Big Bang, by showing there are all these different new infinite universe cosmologies. And in a way, the multiverse is one of those. Because the multiverse can be formulated as a cosmological theory or as a counter to the fine-tuning argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do want to talk about that. But my first concern is more basic, which is just that how do we generate a likelihood of fine-tuning given theism? How do we make a rigorous or robust argument for thinking that fine-tuning is more likely on theism? Because, for example, if I flip a coin randomly 100 times, the odds of the specific sequence of heads and tails I end up getting will be extremely small. It's 1 part over 2 to the 100. Is that right? It's very tiny.
Yep.
But of course, merely the sheer improbability of the scenario is no reason to think that God intervened to bring about that sequence, call it S. And that's because we have no reason to think that God would prefer that sequence over any other random sequence of heads and tails in this kind of non-religious context. And so the likelihood of S from 100 tosses of the coin is just as low on theism as it is on random chance. So it's critical that we show that fine-tuning, even if it has a low likelihood, a ridiculously low likelihood on naturalism, it's got a higher one on theism. Why should we think that?
Because probabilities are not the only thing in play when we're talking about fine-tuning as a phenomenon. I don't know if you've read the work of my colleague William Dembski and his groundbreaking piece, The Design Inference. That's me, sorry.
No worries.
The informality of the podcasting medium, right?
Right.
Sorry about that.
No, you're okay.
Yeah, but there's something else at work in fine tuning, and we have uniform and repeated experience of fine tuning. Whether we're talking about French recipes or a finely tuned radio dial, or a finely tuned internal combustion engine, or a finely tuned software functioning on hardware. What do we mean by fine tuning? Fine tuning is a system in which you have an extremely improbable arrangement of parts or characters that collectively work together to perform some identifiable function or achieve some significant outcome. And in the I think chapter 8 of Return of the God Hypothesis, I update Dembski's notion of a specification. And the idea is that what's at work in fine tuning is a small probability event that is also specified, where a specification could be described as a pattern that can be described with a highly compressible short description. So in fine tuning of the universe, an example would be the faces on Mount Rushmore, highly improbable arrangement of rock, but there's something else at work there. It's not just the improbability of the shape, it's also the improbability of the shape and that it conforms to an independent pattern that we can describe succinctly. Oh, those are the faces of the presidents. And I show how this idea of small probability plus specification is at work in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe, but also that what we mean by fine-tuning when we see systems that are finely tuned, or rather, when we see systems that are finely tuned, that are both highly improbable and specified in this way, invariably they are the product of prior intelligent activity. So we have uniform and repeated experience that suggests that a mind is a causally adequate explanation for the origin of finely tuned systems. And this gives a background knowledge about cause and effect that allows us to affirm higher Bayesian priors for a finely tuned system on theism than on naturalism.
So I have a fairly technical objection that has been bothering me ever since I talked to somebody. His name is Troy Dana on YouTube channel Friction Philosophy. And I think in the end, there are ways around it, but it's actually quite difficult to figure it out. In this situation, in this Bayesian inference, we're asking, let's assume like we didn't know that the universe was life permitting. We would say, what does theism lead us to expect? And then what does naturalism lead us to expect? And I agree with you. Single universe or basic naturalism would lead us to expect to a very, very high degree of probability that the universe would not be life permitting. But then the issue comes when we're trying to ask, what is the likelihood or our degree of expectation in this admittedly strange scenario that God would design the universe and would make it life permitting? Now, in any Bayesian inference, you have background information symbolized by K, and you hold that constant from hypothesis to hypothesis. That's just taken as given. The problem is if you include in the background information that entails that life exists, like, say, all of our prior experience of the connection between fine-tuned products among human beings and having human agency and so on and so forth, well, that background data all by itself is going to entail that the universe is life permitting, no matter what the hypothesis is under consideration. So you can kind of see the issue now. It breaks down the structure of the Bayesian inference. If the information you're taking as given all by itself entails the universe is life permitting, in order to restore the proper probabilities, you'd have to extract everything out of the background, which would entail the universe being life permitting. But then you're left with very little. So you're kind of caught in this dilemma. Did you kind of sort of see what I'm getting at?
Well, Yeah, I do. I also think we may be approaching the limits of what can be addressed conversationally in a podcast.
Sure.
I have a very long technical footnote on exactly that problem
Okay.
in I think chapter 13 of my book. Sometimes I have to go back and read my own stuff
Sure.
when you get into this level of the weeds.
Sure.
But I can see you're a very good philosopher of cosmology. So I am putting together a conference. Maybe we can get you there.
You know what? If
So
that's the result we come to, I'll be happy with that.
yeah.
Okay. Well,
Some of this stuff, I mean, you know how you're doing a PhD in this stuff, and this can get pretty technical. So I don't mean to dodge you, but there's when you get into the background knowledge and pulling out background knowledge and all that. I think at a bare of little brain level, I think we understand from uniform and repeated experience that systems that we describe as finely tuned are invariably the product of intelligence. Something is finely tuned not just because of its improbability, but because of its improbability and specification, so that we can formally give an account of what we mean by fine tuning. And on basic naturalism, fine tuning, one universe naturalism, fine tuning is not at all probable. It is probable given the postulation of a prior mind. Insofar as theism is postulating such an entity, the fine tuning, theism provides a better explanation than basic naturalism. If you want to get around that, the typical way to do that is to, the naturalistic counter move is to posit a multiverse, to then try to render the fine tuning probable given a quasi-infinite, or I always say a gabillion other universes. And there, the problem is not the inability to generate the expectation of fine-tuning, but rather the cost of positing a multiverse, which I argue is the need, first of all, for universe-generating mechanisms, and that the universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed, string theory and inflationary cosmology, both require prior unexplained fine-tuning, which takes you right back to where you started. So the problem with the multiverse hypothesis is not that it doesn't generate an expectation of fine-tuning, but rather that it invariably needs to posit prior unexplained fine-tuning and doesn't provide an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning. And since it doesn't provide an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning, and there is yet one explanation of which we know, one causal explanation of which we know that does generate fine-tuning, and that is a mind, I think even on a multiverse, I think even if the multiverse is true, you have evidence of prior design. And there are other problems I'd point out with the multiverse hypothesis. One is the problem of parsimony. It's not just
Stephen, before you
invoking.
Before you go on, I just wanted to lay the foundation of what is the multiverse hypothesis. Like how does
we're getting way ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, you're okay. And I want to talk about all those things. But like, how does the multiverse even ostensibly explain fine tuning? I mean, one way to think about it is that, for example, if you see a trick shot on YouTube, the fact of them making the trick shot and the ping pong ball hitting all the little objects and then landing in the tiny little hole, that's extremely unlikely. However, if the trick shot attempters do so and attempt to make that shot many, many times, then it becomes more likely that at some attempt or other, they would make it. And you wouldn't be able to observe anything except for a winning trick shot because that's the only one they're going to upload to YouTube. So you have this kind of observational selection effect, which filters over lots and lots of attempts. And then the same idea would hold in the multiverse. If these constants, these quantities...
We call that... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if these constants and these quantities can take on random values, and they do so enough times, if you have a huge collection of a gabillion universes, well, then one of them will likely be fine-tuned just by chance, and we could only ever observe that very one. So you have the same kind of explanatory mechanism at work as what we would appeal to explain this ridiculously improbable trick shot. Why is that a bad explanation? Kind of recapitulate what you said now that we've got the framework in place.
Yeah. Thank you. You provided important context, and I rushed ahead without doing it. But well, let me go back one more step to provide just a bit more context. There's a basic problem. So the multiverse is the idea that the fine tuning, as improbable as it may seem, if we're only considering one universe, is not actually improbable if we consider that there are a quasi-infinite number of other universes out there, and that our universe, and that a universe with the right combination of laws and constants of physics and initial conditions of the universe would have had to arise in one of those many universes. Now, there's an initial problem with that, in that if these other universes are truly separate from one another, if they're causally distinct from one another, such that they have no interactions with one another, then simply positing a gabillion other universes or a quasi-infinite number doesn't actually help explain anything in this universe, including whatever process set the fine-tuning parameters in the first place, because those other universes have no causal effect on this. So merely multiplying what are called probabilistic resources doesn't really do anything in that case. In virtue of that, it's been recognized that you really need something like some kind of underlying universe generating mechanism so that you can portray our universe as the lucky winner of a cosmic lottery, so that all the different universes have at least an underlying common cause. Okay, if you have an underlying common cause, then the probabilities, then you can generate alternatives that are probabilistically meaningful. And so, and naturalists, philosophical naturalists, have done that. They've posited different multiverse verse hypotheses that have different universe generating mechanisms. One of those is the string theoretic multiverse. Another is the inflationary cosmological multiverse. You've got two different speculative cosmologies, and it turns out that, unfortunately, the string theoretic multiverse explains only one class of fine-tuning phenomena, and the inflationary cosmological model explains only a different class. So to explain the entirety of the fine-tuning, you need to conjoin them. And so the most popular multiverse hypothesis now is the inflationary string or string inflationary multiverse. But that's where the ultimate rub comes in, that both of these cosmological models, or in the case of string theory, more a model of fundamental physics, but both these models require prior unexplained fine-tuning to generate new universes. And therefore, the universe generating mechanisms themselves depend on prior unexplained fine-tuning, which takes you right back to where you started. In other words, the multiverse doesn't provide an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning. It does have as an expectation the generation of fine-tuning in our universe, but it does not provide an ultimate explanation for the fine-tuning that makes universe generation possible in the first place.
Something that's not clear to me is the extent to which we need to have a scientifically viable model of the multiverse in order for the multiverse hypothesis to kind of function as an undercutting defeater of our fine-tuning argument for theism. Because, like, you make a good point in your chapter on how to assess a metaphysical hypothesis, that we can be doing metaphysics and we can still use the machinery of Bayes' theorem, for example, or just inference to the best explanation generally, and the criteria associated with it to assess metaphysical proposals. And so I wonder if the naturalist could say something like, yes, okay, those two specific scientific models or theories, they're plagued with problems. They kind of just recapitulate fine-tuning at a higher level. But still, what if we just have this really generic metaphysical multiverse proposal? And we can spell it out in the way that you do, that there's this universe generating mechanism which varies the constants and quantities, and there we go, we have our universe. And you might say, oh, well, but what's the scientific mechanism here? And you might say, no, well, I'm not offering a scientific proposal. I'm just doing metaphysics. I'm not sure about the viability of that kind of response, but when we recognize that, like, theism is a metaphysical hypothesis, then it's kind of like, all right, well, maybe the naturalist can just...
Don't mind things being metaphysical at all. It's fine to be metaphysical. In fact, metaphysics is the subdiscipline of philosophy, which is concerned with describing what is real,
Yes.
ontology. Does science describe what is real? Well, most scientists I know think so.
Yes.
And so, in other words, that's my a rough and ready argument against demarcation. I don't
Yes.
think there are, especially in these questions of origins, are you positing a metaphysical or a scientific hypothesis? Maybe it's both.
Yes.
So I'm not going to get fussed up about that. What the more fundamental problem, and so, but you're saying, well, maybe we don't need, yeah, okay. The inflaton field has to be finely tuned in order to generate new universes.
Right.
So therefore, inflationary cosmology is subject to this problem of prior fine tuning. But maybe there's not a scientific cosmological model that accounts for universe generation. Maybe it's more of a metaphysical model or something. Or maybe. But here's the problem: it's you have. If what we want to account for is specificity among an ensemble of possibilities, you can't get there with something perfectly generic. This is why you can't explain the fine-tuning by reference to some fundamental law or theory of everything. We want to get specificity specificity among an ensemble of improbable options as the output. And you can't get that without some sort of specificity among an ensemble of improbable options as an input. And it's in other words, it's to say otherwise would be a fundamental violation of the conservation of information, and that I think is the problem that naturalists are up against time and time again. Whether you want to hold out for a new universe generating mechanism, I defy you to come up with a universe generating mechanism that can produce improbable specification without starting with some improbable specification. We in origin of life research, this comes up time and time again. People trying to get information for free, and they cannot do it. You get an RNA world hypothesis, but then it turns out that for your RNA replicators to start, you've got to have very specific sequencing of the bases along the RNA molecule to get even rudimentary self-replication going. So you want an RNA replicator so you can explain the origin of biological information, but to get an RNA that will replicate itself, you've got to have prior information in the RNA molecule. This is the problem that emerges in quantum cosmology that we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, that you want to get a universe with specific features, with a specific gravitational field and specific configurations of matter as an output, namely a universe like ours. You got to have a very particular universal wave function, and you can only get that if you impose very specific solutions on the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, or on the mathematical apparatus. Maybe it's not a classical quantum gravitational model of the origin of the universe, but you're going to have to come up with something like that in some other family of solutions to solve the problem of specificity. You don't get specificity for free. And you don't get it from a generic law which lacks specificity.
So what about the Richard Dawkins retort that theism or the God hypothesis is just as complex, or is actually more complex than the universe it's called upon to explain? What do we make of that?
You have raised so many good objections to my argument that have created very good exchanges. I think Professor Dawkins's argument that he's dined out on now for 20 years, is one of the most facile arguments in all of philosophy and all of science. If you allowed that to stand, we could not invoke agency as an explanation for anything. Why are you and I having this conversation? Well, because our minds are engaged in an interesting investigation of the philosophy of cosmology, and we have a desire to communicate to each other. We are explaining the audible transmissions of information passing from your ears to mine and back again by reference to the activity of our minds. Oh, but we can't allow an explanation by reference to agency because a mind is a more complicated thing than the phenomenon that's explaining. The problem with Dawkins's very popular argument is that it's a misreading of Occam's razor. Occam's prohibition or recommendation is that we should not multiply theoretical entities needlessly. What he enjoins against excessively complex explanations that multiply theoretical complex by in virtue of multiplying theoretical entities. There is no injunction against invoking a complex theoretical entity, namely a mind, and we do it all the time.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem to have this principle that the cause has to always be more complex than the effect. That would seem to destroy any sort of inference to, like, say, a heretofore undiscovered ancient civilization. We discover what look to be human artifacts in some unexplored region of the Amazon. We infer, okay, there were human beings here, but then you'd say, oh, well, that's way more complex than the thing to be explained. So either it's not the case that, creative causes, agency is always more complex than the thing to be called upon to explain, or sometimes that inference is warranted, even if it is an increase in complexity.
Excellent, Miles. No, I completely agree. And also, notice what's presupposed in Dawkins' objection is a kind of assumption of reductionism, that we must explain things by reference to simpler forms of matter or simpler forms of material process. Maybe the universe isn't that. He's begging the ultimate question of his very apologetic for scientific materialism. Maybe the universe isn't the kind of thing where everything came from simpler matter. Maybe it's not an in the beginning were the particles universe, and the particles arrange themselves into everything we see. Maybe it's a universe in which in the beginning was a mind. And I actually think that our uniform and repeated experience time and time again shows that there are certain features of our experience that only arise from minds and not from undirected material processes or brute matter. And some of those things that we see are not just human artifacts, are things that we also find in living systems, for example, or in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. So I think his application of the parsimony principle is tendentious and it's question begging, and I don't think it holds. If it did hold, it would have an absurd consequence that we could never invoke agency to explain anything, even, as you point out, artifacts that we know to be produced by human agents.
Before we close, there's one last big picture question that I wanted to place before you, which is that suppose the naturalist agrees with you that the three data points you isolate by themselves are strong evidence against their worldview. There's strong evidence for theism against naturalism. But they will say, when we include all of our data points, not just these three that favor theism, but everything that we know, well, then on the total evidence, naturalism is restored as more likely than theism. And here I have in mind everything that the naturalist or atheist will cite under the rubric of the problem of evil. That evil and suffering, once we put those into the equation, those balance out the scales of the evidence or actually weigh in favor of naturalism. And as I don't think that you address evil and suffering in your book, and not that you should, because you already addressed so many issues. I wonder if you have any succinct reply to the naturalist who says, okay, fine, origin of the universe, design of the universe, origin of life. It's all good evidence for God, but nevertheless, everything we face every day and we read about in the news, that we watch on TV, that we understand through the evolutionary process and animal suffering and death and decay, all of that just swamps the evidence that you've adduced for God. The problem of evil, the reality of evil and suffering is decisive evidence against God. In 2 minutes, can you resolve that issue?
I am resolved. I do have a long footnote about that. Okay. I think it's in chapter 14, Return of the God Hypothesis.
Sure.
The problem for me has never been let me say first of all, before we get into the evil question, I would say that I would expand the data set further than the problem of evil, because I think that is a relevant problem, and I think theists have to engage that to have credibility in the discussion. But I think there's also things like the problem of the reliability of the human mind. I became a theist first when I was persuaded by the argument from epistemological necessity. I think theism provides a much better explanation for the reliability of the human mind than does naturalism. And I think the persistent problem of the sort of postmodern turn in philosophy is a consequence of the prior denial of the reality of God in philosophical circles. I think the problem of an objective form of morality, which all of us inadvertently affirm in the way we act and in the way we argue, I think is also something that theism provides a much better explanation for. I also happen to be a biblical theist. I'm Christian, and I'm very persuaded of some of the historical narrative of the Bible because of the extensive corroboration of that narrative through extra biblical and intra biblical sources. So there's, for me, a lot of data that comes to bear in deciding the totality of one's worldview and in which one makes the most sense. But as to the problem of evil, never been very bothered by the problem of human evil. I take the free will defense to be adequate. The more challenging problem is the problem of natural evil. And that's the one where most naturalists would lay most stress. So we can be in agreement about that. And here I take the biblical framework for my worldview is helpful. If you read William Paley and some of the natural theologians from the 19th century, you got the feeling that they maybe never left a Cambridge or Oxford garden, that they saw all of nature as this perfectly manicured, perfectly designed system. But when you encounter the biblical account of what we should expect in the natural world, you encounter two things. The book of Romans is instructive in that regard. Romans chapter 1 tells us that the things that are made bear the marks of have the unseen. From the things that are made, we can see the unseen qualities of God, His eternal power and divine nature. In many older translations, rendered wisdom. So you see the intelligence and power of God in the things that are made. But in that same book, we're also told that the creation is groaning for its redemption and that it's been subjected to some form of decay. And so when we look at nature from the standpoint of biblical theism, I see what I think you should expect to see in nature, both evidence of an aboriginal design, but evidence of some subsequent decay as well. And so there's a kind of confirmation of a Bayesian expectation of biblical theism, though not maybe a Neoplatonistic generic theism of the sort that I think some of the natural theologians fell into. So that's my 2-minute answer. There's more in the book about some of the processes responsible for the degradation of information in biological systems. I think mutation has been given lots of plaudits for its creative power, but I think actually what we typically find is that it's degenerative and it's a natural process that destroys original information.
Stephen Meyer, thank you for coming on the podcast today. I think you'll agree. We had a very substantive, interesting conversation. Your book is lovely, very well written. One of the rare books that strikes the balance between technical sophistication and readability. So good work, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
I appreciate the conversation. I hope your listeners enjoyed it as much as we did, and I'm flattered that you read the book, especially chapter 12. It was my favorite chapter. Or was it 12 or 10? I can't remember. How to test a metaphysical hypothesis. I think that's the linchpin of. If you get that right, then theism looks a lot more plausible. So.